Well, welcome to history class, everybody. This is the third and final of the first week videos for Information Visualization Design Studio, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of data viz and the history more generally of the visual communication of data. Two things before I get started though. The first one, this is a very nerdy video. We're going to go in deep on some pretty esoteric topics. That's just a thing I like to do because I'm a massive geek. Hope you'll enjoy it. Second thing I want to mention is that a lot of stuff in this video, as well as some of the stuff in many of my other videos, comes from Edward Tufte's book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. This is an absolute classic in the field of data viz. I'll make sure it's linked in the Canvas readings. It's pretty old now, but what it covers is the basics of data visualization, why it happens, why it's useful. It does tend to come at it from more of a data analyst perspective. Let's see how we can visualize in order to understand the data, rather than let's see how we can visualize in order to communicate the data, like we've been talking about from a design perspective. But it's an easy read. It goes through some stuff in a really nice, straightforward way. And if you get a chance to check it out, please do. It is not set as a textbook or anything for the course. It's quite an expensive book. I don't expect you to go out and buy a copy, but it's something that I think you should have a flip through whenever you get a chance. So I want to get back to that question, just like I was talking about with Tufte. Why would you want to visualize something? Well, you want to communicate something that is too complex to just talk about, or for whatever reason, in the context you're in at the moment, maybe you're far away from someone, maybe you only have the written word, you can't communicate. You can communicate anything given enough talking, but sometimes there are much more efficient ways to do so. That's absolutely not the right button. I thought that by the third video, I would maybe have my hotkey game down, but it appears that is not the case. All right, so one place to start a history of data viz would be with some of the first recorded actual data visualizations. This is from a fellow called William Playfair, who is a Scottish engineer, political economist, and also spy. A little bit more about him later. This is a chart showing the trade imbalance, so imports versus exports between Britain and some other European countries in the late 17th century. Hey, quick update from the future. I'm just editing this video now. I'm an idiot. I said 17th century. The 1700s are obviously the 18th century. As I said, don't trust me with historical facts. Let's get back to the data viz. Playfair was actually one of the inventors of a number of the basic forms of chart that we use, or at least the person who first codified and wrote it down. But I want to go back before this and talk about how data, how information has been communicated visually even earlier. So jumping back from the 17th century to the 6th century BC, this is the oldest recorded map. This is a map of the world, or at least the area around the ancient Mesopotamian city of Babylon. This is from the 6th century BC, which is the Second Babylonian Empire. Babylon was also the center of another empire about 900 years earlier. Not that that's particularly important to this course. Check it out if you're interested. This is a schematic map. You can see here that nothing is actually intended. See the circle there and the dots around it. To give you an idea, the vertical line down the middle there is the river, and then the horizontal bar across the top is the city of Babylon. You can see it crosses the river. Some of the points marked around it indicate points of interest in the area, and the spikes around the outside indicate mountains and things like that. Those little scratchy writings around the side are cuneiform text, which is the alphabet of the era. But what's important to note about this map is that it's not really, sorry, I have to look this way to see it and then point that way. That's a little bit wild. That just happens to be that my monitor is physically over there, but of course the video not important. This is a schematic map. This map shows the relationships between things without trying to represent the geography of the area, which I think is actually a start on some of the ideas of data viz that we're interested in. We're looking at the relationships, the comparisons between things. more than we are interested in the absolute whole and complete truth, like you might get from a fully detailed representational map of an area, because that's what's interesting to those people. What would you need to do with a map in the 6th century BC? Travel, move around, recognize where you are, recognize landmarks. To them, that was much more useful than knowing exactly how many kilometers there were between landmarks. But I think a history of the idea of communicating visually goes back even further than that. This is possibly, it's disputed, the oldest piece of art in Australia. This is from about 17,000 years ago, and you can just see the depiction of a kangaroo. Here's a version of it. An artist has gone over and emphasized just the original carving. So this is a 17,000-year-old piece of indigenous art representing a kangaroo, which was dated as older than any other art piece that we have recorded in the country. And these sorts of cave paintings, here is an even older one. This is possibly the oldest piece of cave painting in the world. This is from Lubang Jeriji Saleh Cave in Borneo, Indonesia. And it is at least 40,000 years old. Dating these things can be a little tricky. It's thought that these sorts of cave paintings were originally ritualistic, artistic, maybe part of rituals involved in ensuring that there was a fair hunt or something. Entirely speculation on my part and on the part of other historians. But pretty quickly, these drawings became used to communicate. What game is there in this area? How can you move in a direction where you'll get to more? Where is something that you need to pay attention to? And there's also the question of who lived here. So these cave paintings got used to capture identity and people and information. That's what we're talking about here. This is information. This is from probably one of the most famous cave paintings in the world. This is from Lascaux Cave in France. It's actually a complex cave system filled with many, many thousands of cave paintings dating about 17,000 years old. And it's interesting to note that this idea of a negative hand print, so the hand is placed on the wall and then some kind of pigment is rubbed over the top of it, this occurs in almost all human cultures who have a history of cave art, which is almost all human cultures. This notion of recording ourselves, this is the hand, this is me, is probably one of the earliest ways of recording data about people. These are the people who lived here. These are their hands. Analysis shows that in the Lascaux Cave, these are thought to be mostly adolescent male hands. Interestingly, almost always the left hand, indicating this could have been part of a ritual, a coming of age practice, or something along those lines. I'd like to note in all of these historical talkings that I'm just a guy who read Wikipedia a bunch while going down this particular rabbit hole about the history of storing information. Please do not take my word or any of these images that I've literally just gotten from Wikipedia as an indication of true historical fact. If you're interested in that, please take an elective in history. Some of them are super interesting. I'm just trying to give you an idea of the narrative, the history behind the human concept of visually representing data. But I think our story of how information is represented takes a pretty big diversion somewhere around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, as pictures evolved into depictions of ideas, evolved into depictions of concepts, and eventually evolved into depictions of sounds. Look at the top row here. This is a Proto-Sinaitic script from about 4,000 years ago. Look at that top left image, the image of a bull or a bull's horns. How much does that directly remind you of some of those cave paintings I showed earlier? Here's another image from the Lascaux Cave showing almost exactly that same bull head shape. This is apparently what cows looked like before we tinkered with their genome for thousands of years. You can see how that bull's head up in the top left there evolved over 1,000 years into a stylized representation of a bull's head. You can see the slash through a kind of triangle showing horns at the top and a neck at the bottom. And it wasn't really too much of a leap from there to ancient Greek, Old Italic, and then Old Italic script like Etruscan pre-Roman scripts, and then from there to the Roman alphabet that we effectively use today. This is the same thing for a number of the other characters that we're familiar with. Look in the middle, in the green area, at the dashed line that indicated the jagged line that indicated a river, which turns in the Phoenician script, the second row, into a kind of MY hybrid, and then in ancient Greek turns into something we would now recognize as an M with a descender at the end, and then over time, of course, into an M. That's the origin of M, the sound that presumably was associated with the first syllable of one of these ancient words for river. Same for N, actually originally came from snake. So there's a depiction of a snake that's evolved in much the same way, but with one fewer kink. So this isn't a typography class. Why am I telling you this? Because pictures evolve to mean ideas. Sequences of pictures could be composed to mean abstract or complex ideas. Relational ideas like middle or above could be shown using ideograms. Remember that map of Babylon where the idea that the city spanned the river could be shown by putting one on top of the other. All of these images that eventually evolved into characters are ways of representing more and more information in a more and more concise way. This is the idea that we still follow today in data viz, just taken to an ancient extreme. I don't want to seem like I'm singling out European cultures here. This is the same idea evolving in other regions of the world. At the top there you can see some of the Mesopotamian depictions of objects, fish, bird, axe, arrow, bottle, and how they evolved over time into the cuneiform script that we saw on that ancient Babylonian map. But the same thing can be applied with Egyptian, originally hieroglyphic depictions that would then have evolved into hieratic script and then into something that is considered the forerunner of modern Arabic script. And the same thing appears in China, pictograms turning into the forerunners of the traditional Chinese character set. These are images that we have stylized, learnt, and now use as shorthand for much more complicated concepts. Now, there's much more to say about the history of writing and the history of language and the history of alphabets. I'd encourage you to look into that on your own time. I do want to bring this back towards the notion of data viz. So now I want to return back to Babylon. You can see now the cuneiform script, that sort of multiple small dashed lines that they used for their alphabet because their alphabet was carved on stone. It's quite easy to do small lines when what you're writing with is a chisel. All of that information around the edge shows a lot of detail about this map. But even with all that writing, it couldn't come close to depicting all of the information that is shown visually on the map. Maps show huge amounts of information in a very concise way. Imagine writing out all the relationships. The river is in the middle. The city is on both sides of the river. There are 3 mountains. The big one is to the northwest. Another one is to the east. The city is to the southeast of the mountains. This other point of interest is to the north of this mountain, but to the east of that mountain. That is so much writing, depicting all of those relationships with a mapping, in this case showing their position on a map as a way to represent, to stand in for, a kind of metaphor for their position in the real world, lets you represent that information much more concisely. This is exactly the kind of thing that we use as designers, as infographic designers, to depict relationships in the modern world. So here's, I think, a really interesting example. This is an ancient map, or a Roman map, a classical map of the Roman road and port network. It's called the Tabula Peutingeria. Peutingeria? Let's just assume that my Latin's awful. Here's a close-up of part of it. This is Rome in the center, showing the road network spidering out from it. Again, this It's a tapestry, it's many meters long. This shows relationships, not geography. It's showing what roads access what. It's not trying to show you the distances or the relationships between them. As you saw, this is not the shape of the Roman Empire. This is just a schematic, a diagram that shows you what is connected to what. If that sounds familiar, we have a relatively modern invention of why it is easier to show a schematic depiction of the connections between things rather than show a geographic depiction of where those things exist in the real world. We call them subway maps. This is the first modern subway map to be produced in that schematic style. This is a 1930, I think, 3 depiction of the London Underground by a guy called John Beck. I think it's John Beck. It's Harry Beck. John Beck was an actor in the 1980s. He played hardball businessmen on TV. I'm just trying to give you an idea of why we now look at train network maps, a bit like this one. Same as the Sydney Trains map, same as the New York subway, the Tokyo subway system. Everything is depicted showing a network. This is exactly the same notion as the ancient Roman schematic map. This was actually what the what the London Underground map looked like a decade or so earlier. This is from about 1908. This is a pretty useful way of knowing exactly where the underground stations are on a physical map. But it's much harder to answer questions like how many stops from here to Oxford Circus? Where do I have to change to get from here to there? These things are much easier to answer if you have access to a schematic map. So now we're starting to see the emergence of infographic design, the emergence of data viz as a design discipline. The reason why we use these maps rather than these maps is because we're not trying to represent the world as it is. We're trying to represent the world in a way that is useful for a purpose. The purpose of an audience, in this case commuters, in a particular context, in this case hurrying to a train platform and trying to figure out where they need to get on and where they need to get off. The detailed representation of this map does not serve that purpose, and so we abandon representationalism and move towards the schematic. It's interesting, I think, that we've looped back to that way of thinking about maps, at least in some cases, because that was the only option that the Romans had. They didn't have aerial surveillance of their empire. They could only think of things in terms of relationships because those were the things that they understood. They're very human scale things. If you ride roughly westward for 3 days from this city, you'll get to that fort. That's the kind of information that they had. We developed the technology to properly survey, to properly develop maps. We developed a field of cartography, modern cartography, representing everything down to the 10th of a meter. And then when it comes time to get on and off our subway trains, we don't need it because it's not a case of accuracy. It's a case of fit for purpose. So now I want to return to Playfair. William Playfair was considered the originator of visual statistics. He invented the line chart, the pie chart, the area chart, the bar chart. He may not have been the first person to use all of those, but he's certainly the person who is credited with writing them down and giving them names. This, as I said, was a trade surplus/deficit chart from 1786. It's interesting to note that Playfair did all this while reporting on the French Revolution in a clandestine way. As I said, he was a spy. And he also had a little side hustle collapsing the French economy through a massive money counterfeiting scheme. The French economy, the French currency during the revolutionary period was a bit wacky, and it served the interests of the British Empire to have it fall apart. So there you go. The guy who invented the pie chart was a hustler, counterfeiter, and spy. Beyond the somewhat bloody capitalist beginnings of data visualization, I think it's interesting to talk about some of the earliest visualizations that were designed to make the world a better place. This is Florence Nightingale's mortality chart in the Crimean War. Now, Florence Nightingale was a statistician, an educator, a hospital administrator, and effectively the founder of the modern practice of nursing. I always love reading about these people from hundreds of years ago who had 17 different careers. But Florence Nightingale wanted to convince the military brass that people were dying of preventable reasons. Specifically, that military hospitals were awful. They were full of rats. They were full of rotten food. They were full of unclean beddings. That people were urinating and defecating in and among their sheets. Patients with different infectious diseases were mixing together during their most infectious periods. And you can see this by looking at these radar charts. The blue shows soldiers on a campaign who were dying of infections or other preventable diseases. The red shows soldiers dying of their wounds, and the black shows other causes. So you can see that the red, people dying in some of the bloodiest wars to date, the mid-1800s was a particularly unpleasant time to be a soldier, not that there's ever been a very fun one, but still, area for area represents the number of deaths. 5 to 10 times as many people were dying of infections, were dying in hospitals of preventable reasons. Florence Nightingale successfully used this to convince people that money should be put into basic sanitation in hospitals. She was the person who first pushed the public health idea that you should wash your hands in a hospital. These are pretty basic ideas. Now, at least, we think, although reflecting on the last year, maybe the basic idea that you should isolate yourself when you're sick and wear some kind of cloth over your face and wash your hands, maybe that's a little bit more contentious than we thought 170 years after Florence Nightingale pointed it out to us, but that's a separate story. This shows, the chart on the left shows that after she introduced her reforms in sort of the middle of 1856, the number of preventable deaths dropped off rapidly, even when the campaign was staying quite vicious, even when there were still many people dying of wounds and getting injured. It took data visualization to take this complex and many variable data set and make it a form that people could understand. The military brass did have access to the data. There were books of names of people who had died and the causes of which they died. There was pretty good record keeping in these military hospitals at the time, even if they weren't washing their hands or using soap. But those records were not telling the story. They needed to be turned into data visualization in order to help make the world a bit of a better place. Sticking on the notion of death for a moment, I apologize to be covering such a macabre subject here, but many of the earliest visualizations are visualizations of war and death because those were the issues that concerned those in power hundreds of years ago. So back to maps, back to death, back to war. This is Charles-Joseph Minard's flow map of Napoleon's losses in his Russian campaign in 1869. Minard was a civil engineer who, after retiring, started focusing on this idea of visualizing flow through systems. He looked at sewer maps, he looked at transport maps, and most famously, he looked at this campaign of Napoleon's. This is so striking because the width... Let me explain the chart a little bit first. This, like the Roman and Babylonian maps, shows relative positions, but now overlaid on those relative positions, you can see Moscow on the far right and the river from which the campaign started in, I think it was Poland, on the far left. So Napoleon with the brown-sized army, the width of that bar shows the number of soldiers that were present in the army. It was about 420,000 at the start, and over the course of the campaign, the brown shows them during the advance, and then the black shows them during the retreat. That number dwindled down over various battles, over various losses, to less than 10,000 soldiers returning with Napoleon. This will give you an idea of why it's never a good idea to start a land war in Asia. And hopefully, maybe not, hopefully some lessons may have been learned. So just one more map from the history lessons, I promise, just one more. This is a map of the area around Broad Street in London from 1854. This map was drawn by a doctor named John Snow. And unlike certain other John Snows, this one knew something. This shows the little bars, the little black bars around the edges of streets, show the number of people in that area, in that house or apartment building or whatever, who died of cholera during an outbreak. You can see that they cluster around Broad Street in the middle, particularly one block on Broad Street, in which there is a pump. John Snow had for a while believed this crazy idea that cholera and possibly other infectious diseases were spread through drinking water, contaminations in drinking water, which sounds totally obvious to us now, but at the time it was believed that infections spread through miasma, through the atmosphere, through some kind of clouds of generic badness. The idea of microbiology had not been invented at the time, so the notion that there could be something living in the water that could get into your body was a pretty crazy one. But John Snow believed that the answer to preventing these outbreaks was a sewer system, a septic system, some way of getting all of the human waste out of the streets so that it wouldn't end up in the drinking supply, in the water supply. He used this visualization showing that, yeah, actually all of the cases were clustered around one area, and that some of the outliers were people who could be documented as having gotten their water from that pump. He showed this, he built this, he explored the data himself, then went and tested the water at the pump, showed that it made people sick, and eventually this led to the construction of the world's first sewer system. This indirectly led to the modern idea of sanitation departments. So now, fast forwarding 150 years, we use data visualization for all sorts of things. We still use, particularly in the last year, to capture ideas about preventable death, but we also use it to understand the meaning in our world, to capture entertainment and joy and happiness. We, of course, as I said in the intro video, live in a world where there is much more data. We don't just have books of the dead anymore, but we have data capturing everything about our every life. We have so much digitized text that you can use machine learning to capture how the meanings of words have changed over time and depict them graphically. This is a really interesting piece of work that came out of Stanford about 5 years ago. It shows how the meaning of different words has changed over time using graphical relations, using visual relationships to other words. In this case, you can see that awful in the 1850s, when all of those awful depictions were shown, used to mean full of awe, as in majestic, solemn, dread, full of dread. But then it slowly moved in that direction of dread. And by the 1900s, the early 1900s, it meant appalling, awful, sort of recognizable for now. Language is not static. The characters that we use, as I described at the beginning of the video, may be static, but the meanings of words are, there's a word polysemous that means having multiple meanings. Don't write that down, that's not important for this course. I just told you there'd be nerdy things in this video. Words not only have multiple meanings, they have situationally constructed meanings. And those meanings change over the course of a sentence, over the course of a conversation. They change based on who you're talking to. But it is possible to track how those words have changed over time using a combination of data viz and a bit of clever machine learning. Here's another fun one. The word broadcast obviously didn't always mean to do what I'm doing now, to record some information and broadcast it out to all of my viewers. It was originally a tool for agriculture. It meant to scatter seeds around in every direction. A broadcaster was a tool for spreading seeds. So you can see in the 1850s, it meant spread, scatter, sow. These were the other words that had the closest meaning to broadcast. By 1900, it meant to circulate. It was associated with newspapers. And by the 1900s, the 1990s, it was associated with radio, television, BBC, etc. Here's a fun one. The word gay. We know the word gay has changed a great deal over time. In the 1900s, it actually meant kind of like, interestingly, tasteful or flaunting, so maybe over the top, but also daft, as in silly and goofy. By the 1950s, it meant witty, pleasant, frolicsome. By the 1990s, of course, it has taken on the meaning that we understand today. We use these basic techniques, these techniques of data visualization, focusing on relationships, focusing on representations, focusing on comparisons between quantities of interest every day in our modern lives. We also understand how, when we're communicating something as a designer or just in a conversation, we understand how to surface what's important. We understand to focus on things, just the things that are important to us. We understand the same things that people have understood for thousands of years. It's not about representing everything. It's not about communicating everything. It's about understanding what is important. What is just the information that the other party or other parties need? And what is the most concise, compelling way to communicate it? If this was a writing course, we'd now be talking about rhetorical tools to communicate your intent as concisely as possible. If this was a visual communication course, we'd be talking about how to use graphical tools, color, shape, type, to communicate your intent as concisely as possible. If this was an interaction design course, we'd be talking about how to use layout, eye flow, calls to action, good and useful hierarchy design to communicate the purpose or the actions that you want people to take. But perhaps, alas, this is an InfoVis course, but the same principles apply. We're going to be talking about how to direct your users, your viewers' attention to the most important parts of your visualization so that they can understand the mapping and understand the quantities and understand the insights and the narrative that you want them to take away from that as fast as is possible. We'll talk about the differences between designing for someone who has 5 seconds to peruse your map, like the case of the subway schematic, where someone only has maybe a minute or so before they really, really need to go get their train. And how that differs from a visualization, like those historical word meaning ones we were just talking about, where you might have a couple of minutes to engage with it more deeply, and how you would use different techniques to communicate effectively in those different situations. Things have to be designed differently for this, for the context or the purpose or the audience, even if they're representing very, very similar information. There's no one right way to represent anything. There's instead a contextually appropriate approach. That's why we're doing design. If there was one right way, we would have no need for designers. We just write down what's the right way to do everything, and then I guess we all go get different jobs. But the thing I wanted to communicate by taking this little bit of a rabbit hole video at the beginning of the semester is that none of these are new ideas. We're certainly going to be using new tools. We have more access to data, more free access to accurate data than any of these ancient civilizations did. We also have more of a voice, more of a capacity to represent this data and to design things and to get those things in front of powerful people. We have more of a capacity to change the world for the better than people ever have in the past. We have the opportunity to use these techniques, to use the data in the world around us, the opportunity as designers to address some of these challenging problems. And also to use our design skills to get ourselves an effective career. So the message out of this first week is not only is data viz design, but these are ideas that people, that civilizations have been using for thousands of years to tell their stories. The history of humanity, at least the history of civilization, humanity since the dawn of agriculture, is a history of information. More and more concentrated information and more compelling and more concise ways to communicate it. So, smash that like button, make sure to subscribe with notifications on, and come with me over the next 13 weeks and let's learn how to do that.